Stop. Before you waste your money, you need to understand what a double die is and whether this is one or not. Stay tuned. I'm going to tell you a lot about this coin. You need to hear this information. Hey y'all, this is Frostbite. And as you can tell from the title of this slide, this is not a double die. We're going to be talking about the Bessie Coleman 2023 quarter. Now, there's a couple things that I want to talk about before we begin, and those are kind of some of the misconceptions. Doubling means double die. That's not necessarily true. There is a difference between a doubled coin and a doubled die. The actual double die is doubling on the die itself, whereas like in mechanical doubling or shift doubling or incurse doubling, we'll get into what that is. It has to do with either the die bouncing or something being shifted in the process of actually minting that coin, right? Old coins are the same as new. That's not necessarily true. There is a change in the way that they do some of the coins, whereas the surface on the coin is not always raised. Sometimes it's actually indented or impressed into the planchet. We're going to talk about that here in just a few moments. One that I've heard a lot over the course of the last few days, and that is coin people are out to get you or steal your money. That's not true. There may be a bad apple here or there, but ultimately, people that own coin shops or work in that, yeah, they have a business to run, but they're out there to help you. They're genuinely out there to give you good information. And if they tell you that you have a coin that's not an error and they don't ask to buy it from you, odds are it's not an error, right? And so they're not going to say, well, you need to put this back into the hopper and, I'm going to find it somewhere in the community. The odds of that happening are probably less than you win in the lottery. So I just want to make sure that people understand, yeah, well, coin shops may not be the place to go for you. You may not like that. You may not like the people. They're genuinely good, honest, hardworking people who know a lot about coins. And if you take just a moment to listen to them, you might actually learn something. The last one is just a joke. It says I'm not infallible or I'm infallible. And the reason that I'm doing this particular video is because I made a mistake and I learned a lot of information. And because I've learned information, it's important to me to put it in language that people can understand. Areas where I find it confusing or I found it a little bewildering, I wanted to clarify, give you some good solid examples, and have you walk away with something that could be extremely beneficial to you. So I ask you to stay tuned, watch this whole thing. It's going to be really important. It's going to really help you understand some of the little nuances that will help you understand what's on a coin and help you make better informed decisions, especially when purchasing what you believe to be an error coin. So what I'm going to talk about first is I want to talk about normal strikes. So what is a normal strike? Well, I thought that a wave pattern might give us a really good example of what we're looking at. So in the coin, you can see that this dotted line would be the surface of the coin, okay? Now, when the die comes down and presses, the material is shifted out, okay? But because there is a void in this area, the metal from the planchet is bunched up. It's piled up into the item here, leaving a raised surface. This is what they mean when they call it a normal strike. However, when you talk about an incuse strike, and an incuse strike is actually exactly the opposite. And that's when you have a raised surface on the die. Now, what's happening in this situation, again, this is the surface of the coin. What's happening in this situation is that when they're pushing down, the information is being indented into the planchet and the material's being pushed up and out. Okay, now there was an example of drawing or putting your hand in the sand and then drawing a line over it. And so if you were to draw a line over the top of this with your finger, right, like a scratch, then it would appear to be above or behind because this is still dropped down. That's a hard concept to grasp. But if you remember that on the surface of the coin, especially these quarters, and the initials, the engraver's initials in particular, they're actually not raised. They're actually indented into or imprinted into the planchet. And so you can't have a raised double die because it's actually not even raised. What would happen in this case in a double die is that this trough, right, would actually be more narrow. So it may actually only come down like this. And that would result in the item appearing very, very skinny instead of wide normal. Now, I don't really have a great example of that. I can show you some of that later. But if you're interested in seeing images of that, do just Google a Incuse image of a double die, and it will show you. There's a penny. It's a great example of a normal date, and they show you what an actual double die in an Incuse strike looks like, and that will help you understand a little bit more about what you need to look for. Now, what I'm going to show you next is I'm actually going to show you a die of a ASC, Silver Eagle. And what I want to point out here is something that might help you understand this a little better. So you can see how the image is actually carved into the die. Now, what's going to happen is when this is depressed, right, all the metal is going to fill these voids, leaving a raised surface on the coin. So when you look at the raised surface of a coin, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go back to this where we talk about the raised item. This area here is actually going to leave this raised area. It's going to push this other metal out, and it's going to actually leave a raised surface. That's where you get the high relief. And that's why the deeper this item is, the higher the relief is going to be, meaning the higher this bulge is going to be piled on the surface of the coin. Now, counter to that is the Incuse die. Now, the Incuse die, I'm going to point at this particular here, which is the counter stamp. And when you look at the date in the 2022, this date would actually be embedded into the die. However, this Incuse stamp would be raised in the die. And what would happen with this, because this is raised in the die, when it hits the surface of the coin, it's going to push this metal down, and it's going to leave this little trough here. And so this is what they mean by an Incuse strike. And again, when you're looking at an Incuse strike, it's not a raised surface. So a double die here would leave a double impression, and that double impression would actually end up making this look skinnier versus wider. Okay, you would still have the same issue when you had the mechanical doubling, which is what you see here, right? Which is the E. Now, when we talk about mechanical doubling or Incuse doubling, you'll see that it's the flat shelf looking type thing. Now, it is set off. Now, here's the tricky part. When you're listening or when you're hearing somebody talk about Incuse doubling, what you have to think about from a standard double die is that it's reverse, meaning that the inverse of the way you think about doubling is true. And that's a little confusing. But when you think about the fact that normally the date would be raised, in an Incuse, it means the date might be depressed. So it actually wouldn't be raised off the surface of the coin. It would be embedded into the coin. This is actually, although it doesn't appear, it's actually embedded into the coin. So this actually is not a raised surface. This is actually pushed into the surface of the coin, much like you would see here on the rim. This is actually been pushed into the planchet, and therefore you have this rim. It's the same thing here. You're going to have a raised surface that is pushing the E and the C down. Now what's happening here is it bounces and you get a little bit of an imprint because that raised surface came over here and pushed this. Now that's a mechanical doubling. It's not an actual double die because, as the term suggests, the die is not doubled, it's a double strike, right? And so it's, again, this is why I want to bring this to the attention, because it's a little bit confusing to the least, right? And so when I explained in my short, which I have removed, that this is true doubling, well, it is doubling, but it's not a double die, okay? And if this were a raised surface, then this in fact would be a double die. Unfortunately, because it's incuse, where it's pushed into the coin, that makes it machine doubling and not a proper double die. Now, I'm going to show you an image here of a 1958 penny, and clearly you can see the difference between the raised lettering here on this, and you can see that all of these are raised. Anybody who's ever looked at a penny knows that these are actually lifted off of the surface of the coin. So that means that on the die, they're actually engraved into the die. So when the die presses on the planchet, the metal actually fills in the gap within the die. And this has actually been impressed into the die itself. So there are actually two sets of grooves that the metal will fill into. And this is why they get the doubling. Same thing happened here in Liberty. And again, the reason that this is not a double die is because this actually is imprinted into, so it's depressed into the surface of the coin. It is not above. It doesn't extend. There's not a hump or a mound like you see in the one above. And so that is the difference between the impressed lettering or the incused lettering. Now, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is looking at additional machine doubling. Now, this is another major item that's on your selling sites, where you're seeing this really solid doubling across the nose and the mouth. It runs basically the entire length of the face on Bessie Coleman. Now, this is actually machine doubling, and the reason that you can see that is that, number one, it's not at the same height. So it doesn't really add anything to that. What it's actually done is just created a shelf. So when you look at this area here, right, you can see that it's not quite raised to the same height as here, but it's actually, there's just this shelf, and it's, again, it's just the shelf all the way down, and it runs pretty much the entire length. It doesn't add any volume here. It's actually just pushed it out, separated, and it's actually dropped down. And that's how you can classify machine doubling. Now, with all of this being said, and I just basically shot down a majority of the items that people are finding within the coin, the question is there any good news? And the answer is yes. There is an error where you have die chips that are on the plane. There's also some die chips on her glove, and I believe there's one on her goggles. So there are some die chips, there are some die cracks that have been identified that you can see. Some of them are in the lettering in Bessie, and other ones are the extra luggage that you see here on the plane. So you can find true errors. If you're a truist and an error coin, then you can, this is a true error coin. But ultimately, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? And so if this is a coin that you want to collect because you think it's cool and this is something that you want to maintain, then by all means collect it. However, I want you just to be informed. It's up to you to decide. It's up to you to make the decision. I just want you to have as much information as you can. And with that, I want to give a special thanks to Live Coin Q&A. I want to thank that team for coming alongside and being very generous in their telling me that I was right in the method by which I stated the double die was there. However, they corrected me on the difference between an incuse die and a double die. And so I really want to thank them for taking time out of their day to correct me and to provide information to me so that I could share it with you. With that, I hope you all get something out of this. I hope this has been extremely beneficial. I hope you have found this of worth. And if you haven't already done so, please smash that thumb, hit that bell, subscribe if you haven't done so. And all of this really helps grow the channel. I appreciate your time. This is Frostbite. Have a great night, and we'll talk to you later.